A black luxury car moved slowly through the narrow streets of a small coastal town, its windows shining in the afternoon sun, its presence attracting curious eyes, because such a car was rare in this quiet place, where most people drove old trucks and simple family cars. And when the door opened, people on the sidewalks froze for a moment, whispering to each other, because the man stepping out was not an ordinary visitor. He was Richard Hale, a billionaire whose name appeared in magazines and, on television, a man known for his empire of investments that stretched across countries, from hotels to technology to real estate, a man whose fortune was so big that no one in the town could even imagine counting it, and yet here he was, walking with calm steps like he belonged in this humble place. Richard did not go to the luxurious hotels near the marina where other rich people might have gone. He did not choose the fancy restaurants where tourists spent heavily. Instead, he walked straight into a small, family-run diner near the harbor, a place where fishermen came after long hours at sea, a place where families gathered for simple meals, the kind of place with wooden chairs, fading paint on the walls, and a warm smell of freshly baked bread. The kind of place no one would expect to see a man worth billions. Inside, the quiet chatter of customers dropped for a moment. Forks paused in midair, children stopped playing with their food, and all eyes turned toward him, though they tried not to stare too obviously, because everyone knew his face. They had seen it in newspapers or online articles, and now he was right there in front of them, tall, dressed simply in a navy suit that still looked expensive even without flashy jewelry. His hair showing a touch of silver. His expression calm, almost gentle, as if he carried no weight of fortune or fame on his shoulders. The waitress, Emily Carter, only 22, felt her heart beat faster as she walked toward him with a menu in hand. She had served truck drivers, fishermen, teachers, and tourists before, but never a billionaire, and she wondered why someone so powerful would choose their little diner, though she forced herself to smile politely and greet him just as she greeted everyone, with kindness and respect, asking if he wanted coffee, which he did. Black, no sugar, no cream, just plain. Richard sat quietly by the window, looking out at the sea where small boats floated in the distance, his mind wandering far away, because despite his wealth, he had been feeling restless. Success had brought him everything a man could buy, but not the peace of mind he secretly searched for. He wanted something real, something unpolished, and perhaps that was why he had come here, to a town where life moved slowly, to a place where no one cared about business charts or stock markets, a place where he could just breathe. As he sipped his coffee, conversations in the diner picked up again, though in hushed tones. People whispered about his presence, some admired him, some envied him, and some wondered if he was here on business or just by accident, because billionaires did not appear in such towns without reason, and rumors already began forming in the air, stories that would travel fast through the community. Richard, however, did not seem to notice or care. He opened the menu slowly, studied it as if it were a business contract, even though the options were simple: burgers, sandwiches, fish and chips, pies of the day, and finally he ordered a plate of grilled salmon with vegetables, something light, something ordinary, and he thanked Emily with a polite nod that surprised her, because she expected him to be cold or arrogant, but instead, he treated her like she was important. As the meal arrived and he ate quietly, more than one person tried to steal a picture on their phone, though carefully, not wanting to be caught, and Richard pretended not to notice, though he had grown used to such attention. He did not come here for fame. He came because sometimes the richest man in the room only wanted the simplest meal in the simplest place where he could be just another customer, nothing more, nothing less. Emily watched him from the corner of her eye as she served other tables, curious about his calmness, wondering if money really made life easier, or if behind those calm eyes there was loneliness, because he ate alone, not surrounded by assistants, not by friends, and not by family. Only silence and the view of the sea kept him company. And though she did not know it yet, his quiet dinner in their diner would soon lead to events that none of them could have imagined. Events that would place her in the middle of a story far bigger than the walls of this small restaurant. For now, though, Richard finished his meal, placed his fork down gently, and pulled out a wallet so slim and neat it looked like it was made for kings. He paid generously, leaving a tip that made Emily's eyes widen, though she thanked him with the same simple grace as she did every other customer. And as he stood to leave, the bell above the diner's door rang softly, announcing that the richest man to ever step into their little town had just come and gone, leaving behind whispers, curiosity, and a quiet sense that something important had just begun. even if no one could see it yet. Richard walked back to his car, but he paused at the door, turning once more to look at the sea, as though searching for something in the waves, something he could not quite name, and though the townspeople thought his visit was nothing more than a passing moment, for Richard, this arrival was the first step into a chapter that would test not only his fortune but his trust, his instincts, and perhaps even his fate. Emily carried the empty plates from Richard's table, her hands trembling just a little, though she tried not to show it, because she had grown up in this town serving strangers, and she knew how to act calm, but inside her chest her heart was racing, still surprised that a man like Richard Hale had chosen their diner, and as she returned to the counter to refill the coffee pot, the little brass bell above the door jingled again, and in walked another man, dressed in a way that made everyone's eyes shift. This new visitor was different from Richard, sharp in a tailored gray suit that looked freshly pressed, polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor, and a watch that gleamed under the lights, almost too shiny for this simple place, almost like he wanted everyone to notice it. He moved quickly, his shoulders squared, his expression too smooth, the kind of man who smiled without warmth, the kind of man who seemed like he was always calculating something, and when he spotted Richard sitting near the window, he smiled wider, striding over with the confidence of someone who thought the world belonged to him. Emily noticed right away how the room seemed to shift, how the quiet comfort of the diner grew tense, because Richard's presence alone was enough to cause whispers. But now with this new man, there was an energy, something she couldn't name, something uneasy, and though she had served countless customers before, she had never felt this knot in her stomach, this quiet alarm that made her watch every step the new man took. "Richard," the man said with enthusiasm as he reached the table, extending his hand as if they were old friends, though Emily could tell from Richard's slight hesitation that they were not, or at least not close, but Richard stood politely, shook his hand and gestured for him to sit. The man introduced himself as Victor Kane, his voice smooth, his words flowing like honey, and almost instantly he began speaking of opportunities, of projects, of money that could be doubled, tripled, even multiplied beyond imagination. He spoke quickly, confidently, like someone who had practiced his speech many times before, and though other customers could not hear the details, Emily, moving around the tables near them, caught enough words: investment, partnership, unprecedented returns, to understand that this was no friendly chat. This was business, the kind of business most ordinary people could never dream of being part of. But what unsettled her was not the talk itself. It was the way Victor leaned in too close, the way he gestured with his hands as if he were trying to paint a picture so dazzling no one could resist, the way his eyes flicked around the room for a moment, cold and sharp, before snapping back to Richard with a false warmth, and Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine, because something in that man's face told her he was hiding something, something important, something dangerous. Richard listened quietly, nodding politely, his expression unreadable, and that made Victor talk even more, filling every silence with promises, with visions of shining skyscrapers in foreign cities, with numbers so big they barely sounded real. And still Emily noticed how Victor's smile never touched his eyes, how behind that charm there was a kind of hunger, a sharpness, like a predator circling its prey. Emily had no reason to involve herself in the affairs of billionaires, no reason to judge a man she had just met, but instincts are powerful and hers were screaming, telling her that Victor Kane was not to be trusted, telling her that this meeting was not a lucky chance but something dangerous, something that could cost Richard more than just money. As she poured coffee for a couple at the next table, she glanced back and saw the subtle shift in Richard's posture, how he leaned slightly away from Victor as though giving himself space, how his eyes narrowed just a fraction when Victor spoke of absolute guarantees. And Emily realized that even Richard, calm and collected as he was, might have doubts, though he kept them carefully hidden under his businessman's mask. But Victor did not stop. He spoke with such determination that it felt like he believed his own words, his hands moving across the table as though he were sketching skyscrapers and highways in the air. And he laughed too easily, too loudly, each laugh falling flat in the quiet diner, drawing more glances from customers who pretended not to listen. Emily's unease grew heavier, pressing against her chest until she almost found it hard to breathe, because she had seen enough of life to know when someone was genuine and when someone was not, and everything about Victor screamed trouble. She didn't know what the trouble was. She couldn't explain it with facts, but she could feel it. the same way a sailor could feel a storm before it appeared on the horizon. When Richard excused himself to take a phone call, rising from the table with his phone pressed to his ear, Victor sat back in his chair, his smile fading for just a second, and in that moment Emily saw his real face, the cold eyes, the impatient frown, the way his jaw tightened as though he was holding back anger, and her heart skipped, because she understood then that his charm was nothing more than a mask, a performance, one he wore only as long as it served him. Emily carried an empty tray past his table, and Victor's gaze flicked toward her, sharp and assessing, like he was measuring whether she had heard too much, whether she was worth noticing, and she quickly lowered her eyes, pretending to focus only on her work, though her mind was racing, repeating the same thought again and again. This man is dangerous. By the time Richard returned to the table, Victor had put his mask back on, smiling wide, leaning forward eagerly, as though nothing had happened, as though he had not just revealed the shadow behind his charm. But Emily had seen enough. She had felt it deep in her gut, and though she tried to keep working, to keep her hands steady, she knew the moment would come when she would have to say something, because sometimes silence could cost more than words, and she could not stand by and watch a man, even a billionaire, fall into the trap of someone like Victor Kane. And so, even as she refilled water glasses and wiped tables, the thought burned inside her, growing stronger with each passing minute. She would have to warn him, even if it was not her place, even if he laughed at her, because something told her his entire fortune, maybe even more than that, was at stake. The diner grew noisier as the evening went on, with plates clinking and soft laughter rising from the tables, but for Emily, the sound faded into the background, her eyes drifting again and again to the corner where Richard Hale sat with Victor Kane, their conversation flowing in low voices that carried just enough for her to catch fragments. Words like millions, contracts, and returns. Words that didn't belong in a small-town diner where most people worried about rent or fishing nets. Not billions. She tried to focus on her work, moving from table to table, but every time she looked back, she saw Victor's hands moving fast, sketching promises in the air, his smile wide but false, his gaze sharp like a blade, and she felt that knot of unease growing tighter inside her chest. It wasn't normal. She thought it wasn't right. And though she had no proof, her instincts screamed louder with every passing minute. Then, as if fate had given her a moment, Richard's phone buzzed on the table, and he excused himself politely, standing and walking toward the door to take the call outside. His tall figure disappeared through the glass door, leaving Victor sitting alone at the table, tapping his fingers impatiently, his mask slipping just slightly, enough for Emily to see the truth. His eyes darkened, his smile dropped, and for the first time, the charm was gone, replaced by something colder, something almost cruel. Emily stood near the counter, holding a pot of coffee, her hands trembling, her mind racing with doubt. Should she say something? Could she? She was just a waitress, a small-town girl who spent her days serving meals, not someone who gave warnings to billionaires about who to trust. But then she thought of the way Victor had looked at her earlier, the way he had measured her, and her stomach turned. She knew that look, the kind of look men gave when they were hiding something dangerous. Her chance came when she saw Richard push open the door and step back inside, still on his phone, his voice low but his face calm. He walked past her, heading toward his table, and in that fleeting moment, something inside her urged her forward, a voice in her head telling her that silence would be worse than speaking. She took a deep breath, her courage trembling but alive, and as Richard passed, she leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper, soft but urgent. Don't trust him. The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous, and for a second, Emily feared she had made a mistake. Richard paused, his eyes flicking toward her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He didn't speak. Not yet, just gave the smallest nod before walking back to his seat, sliding his phone into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst, her hands shaking as she clutched the coffee pot tighter, wondering if she had just stepped into something far bigger than herself, wondering if he would take her warning seriously or brush it off as foolish. She didn't know why she felt so certain. She couldn't explain it with logic, only instinct, only the uneasy feeling that Victor Kane was a man who left ruin wherever he went. At the table, Victor greeted Richard with the same bright smile, as though nothing had happened, as though the mask had never slipped, and he launched right back into his pitch, talking fast, painting pictures of towers of glass and steel, of profits beyond imagination. But Richard's eyes had changed, Emily noticed. Where before he had listened with polite interest, now there was something sharper in his gaze, a quiet caution, as if her whisper had planted a seed of doubt that was already beginning to grow. Victor didn't notice, too caught up in his performance, and Emily moved about the diner, serving other customers while sneaking glances at their table. Her heart still racing, her mind full of questions. What if Richard ignored her? What if he laughed at her later? What if Victor somehow realized she had spoken? The thought made her shiver, but still, she knew she had done the right thing. Minutes passed, and the tension inside her didn't fade. Not even when she smiled at other customers. Not even when she forced herself to laugh at a joke from the cook behind the counter. Her eyes always drifted back to Richard and Victor, and she could tell something had shifted. Something small but important. Richard leaned back now, his arms crossed slightly, asking fewer questions, listening with a cool patience that made Victor talk more, faster, as if trying to regain control. Emily didn't know it yet, but her whisper would become the spark that changed the direction of the entire evening, maybe even the course of Richard Hale's life. She didn't know that behind Victor's shiny promises lay a plan designed to strip fortunes from those who believed him, a plan that had worked on others before, and could have worked again. All she knew, in that simple moment, was that she couldn't stand by in silence, not when her gut told her the truth. When Richard finally stood to leave, shaking Victor's hand one more time, his polite smile never faltering, Emily felt her breath catch. He didn't look at her, not directly, but as he passed by, there was the smallest flicker in his eyes, something that told her he had heard, that he had understood, even if he hadn't said a word. And as the bell above the door jingled once more, and the billionaire stepped out into the night, Emily wondered if she had just changed the path of a man whose life seemed untouchable, a man whose fortune hung in the balance without anyone else realizing it. She returned to her work, heart still pounding, unaware that her whisper had already set into motion events that would reach far beyond the walls of the little diner. Events that would test loyalty, greed, and trust in ways she could not yet imagine. Victor leaned forward with a spark in his eyes, his voice smooth and confident, his words rolling out like a rehearsed performance, every sentence carefully designed to sound irresistible. He spoke of towers that would rise from the ground in cities people barely knew, glass buildings that would shine like jewels, projects that would not only make money but would also leave a mark on history. He painted pictures with his words, colorful and tempting, so full of promise that anyone listening could almost see the future he described. Richard listened quietly, his face calm, his hands folded on the table. To anyone watching, it looked like he was giving Victor his full attention. And in some ways he was, but inside his mind, the whisper of the waitress still echoed, those three simple words, "Don't trust him," circling like a quiet alarm. He tried to push the thought aside, telling himself that business required risk, that suspicion was natural. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily had seen something he almost missed. Victor continued, his tone rising with excitement, his hands moving as though he were drawing invisible maps in the air. He spoke of land rights already secured, of politicians eager to cooperate, of contracts ready to be signed. "The timing is perfect," he said, his smile wide and confident. "This is the deal of a lifetime, Richard. A chance to multiply your wealth, to expand your legacy beyond borders." At another time, in another place, Richard might have felt more drawn in, more ready to believe. He had built his empire by taking risks when others hesitated, by trusting his instincts when others doubted. And Victor's presentation was polished, too polished, like a salesman who had told the same story dozens of times and perfected it. That polish itself made Richard hesitate. Life had taught him that the biggest lies often came wrapped in the prettiest packages. Emily moved between tables with her tray, pretending to focus on her work but listening with her heart pounding, her ears catching pieces of Victor's promises. She heard him say, "Guaranteed returns?" She heard, "Trust me. I've done this before." And every time she heard those words, her stomach tightened more. She had no idea what these men were really discussing, no knowledge of investments or international deals, but she knew one thing. People who offered guarantees in uncertain worlds were often the ones you should fear the most. Victor lowered his voice then, leaning closer to Richard, his smile turning secretive, as though he were sharing something too valuable for anyone else to hear. "You know I wouldn't bring this to just anyone," he said softly. "But with your reputation, with your name attached, the possibilities are endless. We're talking billions, Richard. Billions. And it's all waiting, just one signature away." Richard tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp though his expression remained polite. "One signature," he repeated, his tone calm, almost curious. It was a simple phrase, but behind it was the weight of experience. He had signed many contracts in his life, contracts that built his empire, and he knew better than most that one careless signature could just as easily destroy it. Victor nodded quickly, eager, mistaking Richard's calm tone for interest. "Yes, exactly. That's the beauty of it. Everything has been prepared. All you need to do is join, and the rest will fall into place. You'll double your fortune in half the time. No risks, only rewards." Emily nearly dropped a glass when she heard that. No risks, only rewards. Even without knowing anything about business, she knew that was a lie. Nothing in life was without risk. Her instincts screamed again, louder than before, warning her that this man was dangerous, that his charm was a mask for something darker. She glanced at Richard, hoping he could see it too, though his calm expression gave nothing away. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Victor carefully, letting him talk, letting him reveal more. He asked a few questions, gentle ones, never breaking his polite tone. But every question tested the details, probed the edges of Victor's story. And with each question, Richard noticed something small. An answer that came too fast, a detail that sounded too neat, a number that didn't quite add up. It wasn't enough to accuse, not yet, but enough to make his doubt grow. Victor, blind to the shift, pushed harder, his voice rising with excitement, his promises growing bolder. "This is your moment, Richard. Imagine what people will say when they see what you've built, when they see the empire you've expanded. Don't let hesitation make you miss out. Opportunities like this don't come twice." Emily set down a plate at another table, her hands shaking. She could see how much pressure Victor was putting on him, could hear the urgency in his voice, the way he tried to make it sound like saying yes was the only option. She prayed silently that Richard wouldn't fall for it, that her whisper had done something, anything, to make him pause. Richard gave a small smile then, a smile so faint that only Victor might have noticed. "It's a very impressive vision," he said evenly. "But I've learned something in business, visions need solid ground. Tell me, Victor, where exactly is this ground?" Victor laughed smoothly, brushing off the question, sliding into another practiced answer about opportunities and partners, but Richard was no longer just listening, he was testing. Emily could sense it too, though she didn't know the details. She saw the change in his posture, the way his eyes watched more closely, the way his patience grew sharper. Something had shifted, a quiet battle beginning under the surface. By the time the meal ended, Victor was still talking, still painting his bright picture, but Richard was no longer hearing only promises. He was hearing the silences between the words, the places where truth should have been but wasn't. And through it all, the soft whisper of Emily's voice lingered in his mind, steady as a warning bell, reminding him not to trust too easily. When he finally stood and shook Victor's hand, thanking him politely for his time, Richard's decision wasn't made yet, but his suspicion was alive, and that suspicion would not rest until he uncovered the truth. And as Victor left the diner with that same polished smile, Emily watched from behind the counter, a chill in her chest, knowing deep down that this was only the beginning, that the billionaire's fortune truly hung in the balance, and that her quiet warning had just turned into a battle for the truth. The next morning, Richard Hale sat in his hotel room overlooking the quiet harbor, the sound of seagulls drifting through the open window, the smell of salt in the air. He had spent most of the night awake, his mind replaying Victor Kane's words, each promise, each bold claim, and in between those words he heard something else. Emily's whisper, soft but sharp, "Don't trust him." It lingered in his thoughts like a shadow he could not ignore. Richard was not a man who built an empire by believing everything he heard. His wealth had come from sharp instincts and careful decisions, and though he had taken risks, he had never stepped blindly into anything. Now, as he thought of Victor's glowing presentation, his gut told him something didn't fit, something was off, and he decided he would find out what it was. He started by calling a trusted assistant back in New York, asking her to pull together everything she could on Victor Kane, his past projects, his companies, his business partners. While waiting for her to return the call, Richard opened his laptop and searched quietly on his own. The first results were what he expected. Flashy articles, photographs of Victor shaking hands with powerful men, smiling at glamorous events, quoted in interviews about changing the future. But Richard had lived long enough to know that the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. Scrolling deeper, he began to notice small cracks. A company Victor claimed to have built 5 years ago no longer seemed to exist, its website offline, its name only mentioned in old press releases. Another project he spoke proudly of, a luxury resort, was indeed built. But in the news archives, Richard found quiet lawsuits linked to it, investors accusing the development of hidden debts. None of this appeared in Victor's smooth story at the diner. When his assistant called back hours later, her voice carried hesitation. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "we found some troubling things. Several of Victor Kane's companies dissolved within a few years of being created. In at least 2 cases, lawsuits followed, claims of fraud, missing funds, investors who lost millions. The records were buried, hard to find, but they're there." Richard felt his jaw tighten. Fraud, missing funds, lawsuits. Those were words that didn't appear in Victor's polished speech. He thanked his assistant, asked her to dig even deeper, and hung up. Then he sat back, staring out at the calm waves below, his mind sharper than ever. Emily had been right to warn him. Later that day, Richard visited the addresses Victor had casually mentioned. He went without telling Victor, without announcing who he was, dressed simply so as not to draw attention. The first location, an office building downtown, carried Victor's company name on a faded plaque near the entrance. But when Richard stepped inside, there was nothing. No busy office, no staff, only empty desks and dust. The security guard at the front shrugged when asked. "That office closed months ago," he said. "They packed up and left in the night. Haven't been back since." The second address, supposedly a construction site for a new project, was little more than an empty lot, weeds growing through cracked concrete. A faded sign promised future luxury apartments, but the sign leaned sideways, weathered by rain and sun, forgotten by time. Richard stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty land, thinking of Victor's confident words about investors, about progress, about opportunity. Lies, Richard thought. Carefully built lies. That evening, back in his hotel, Richard reviewed the documents his assistant sent. Contracts Victor had used in previous deals. Hidden in the fine print were traps, clauses written to shift responsibility away from Victor, to protect him while leaving investors exposed. It was a clever trick, one most people wouldn't notice until it was too late. Richard, with years of experience, spotted them immediately. His suspicion hardened into certainty. Victor Kane was a predator, and Richard had nearly become his next victim. Emily's face appeared in his thoughts again, the young waitress who had risked embarrassment, even anger, to whisper those words to him. She had no reason to care, no reason to involve herself, yet her instinct had been sharper than many businessmen he knew. Without her warning, he might have been swayed by Victor's charm, blinded by his promises. For a moment, Richard wondered how many others had fallen into Victor's trap simply because no one had whispered to them. Still, Richard did not act immediately. He was a man who believed in patience, in gathering the full truth before making a move. Over the next 2 days, he continued digging. He called contacts in Europe and Asia, asking quietly about Victor's name. Some spoke cautiously, their voices low, as though they feared being overheard. One businessman in Singapore said, "Victor Kane? Be careful. He has left behind angry investors here. Promises of gold, but the gold never came." Another in London muttered, "He's smooth, very smooth, too smooth." I lost friends because of him. Every story added to the picture. Victor wasn't just careless. He was deliberate, skilled in deception, moving from place to place, creating illusions that lasted just long enough to take what he needed before disappearing. Richard sat late one night with all the information spread before him, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across his tired face. He realized then how close he had come to signing something, how close he had come to risking not just money, but reputation, legacy, everything he had built. Billionaires did not fall often, but when they did, it was often through men like Victor Kane, men who could make greed sound like opportunity. The waitress's whisper now felt less like a simple warning and more like fate itself. It was the small spark that pushed him to look deeper, to question, to uncover the truth. And as Richard closed his laptop and leaned back, he knew one thing for certain. He would not be Victor's victim. No, instead, he would expose him. But the time for quiet investigation was ending. The time for confrontation was drawing near. And Richard Hale, calm and composed as ever, began to plan his next move, knowing that the fortune he had built was safe for now, but only because he had listened to the quietest voice in the diner, the voice that had told him not to trust. The evening was calm, the town quiet as the sun sank into the horizon. But inside Richard Hale's mind there was no calm at all. For 2 days he had gathered every piece of evidence, every hidden truth about Victor Kane. Now the picture was clear. Victor was no partner, no visionary, only a fraud dressed in expensive suits, a man who had built a career out of lies and charm. Richard knew the time had come to face him. He chose the same diner where it had all begun. It seemed fitting. That simple place with wooden chairs and warm light had been the stage for Victor's performance, the place where Emily had whispered the words that saved him. Now it would become the place where the mask came off. Richard arrived early, dressed in his usual calm elegance. This time he wasn't alone. A lawyer from his company, a man named Harris, sat at a corner booth, blending into the background, a folder of documents hidden inside his briefcase. He would not interfere unless needed, but his presence was insurance, proof that Richard had come prepared. Emily noticed Richard when he walked in. Her heart skipped for a moment, because she remembered her whisper, the risk she had taken, and she wondered if he had believed her. He gave her a small, polite nod, not a smile, but something that told her he remembered. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, though she had no idea what was about to happen that night. The bell above the door jingled, and Victor Kane strode in with the same polished confidence. His smile wide, his steps steady. He spotted Richard at once and walked over quickly, as though he were certain of victory. "Richard, my friend," he said warmly, sliding into the seat across from him. "I was hoping we'd talk again. I trust you've been thinking about my proposal." Richard didn't answer immediately. He studied Victor with calm eyes, letting the silence stretch long enough to make Victor shift slightly in his seat. Finally, Richard said, "Yes, I've been thinking a lot." Victor leaned forward eagerly, mistaking the words for interest. "Excellent. I knew you'd see the potential. The opportunity is once in a lifetime. If you're ready, I can have the papers drawn up tomorrow. We can make history together." Richard's voice was quiet, but steady. "You're right about one thing, Victor. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but not the kind you think." Victor blinked, the smile faltering for just a second. "I don't follow." Richard placed a slim folder on the table, tapping it lightly. "I had my people look into your past. Every company you mentioned, every deal you claimed to build. And what did I find? Empty offices, failed projects, lawsuits buried in the dark, investors left ruined. You've left a trail, Victor, a trail of lies." The air between them grew heavy. Victor's smile froze, his eyes narrowing, though he tried to recover quickly. "Rumors," he said dismissively, waving a hand. "Old stories twisted by people who failed to understand business. Every great man has enemies, Richard. Surely you know that." But Richard didn't move, didn't blink. His calm was sharper than anger. "Enemies? No, Victor. Victims. You've made a career out of deception. You think charm can hide the cracks, that fast words can cover the truth. But not with me. Emily, serving a table nearby, slowed her steps, her breath catching. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the tension in Richard's voice pulled her in. She glanced toward them, her stomach tight, realizing she was witnessing something important, something dangerous. Victor leaned back, trying to regain control, his tone sharper now. Careful, Richard. Words like that can ruin reputations. You wouldn't want to start a war with me. Richard leaned forward just slightly, his eyes locked on Victor's. A war? You've already lost. I've seen the contracts you use, the traps you hide in the fine print. My lawyer has them now. If I wanted, I could expose you in every paper, every boardroom. You wouldn't sell another lie again. Victor's jaw tightened, his mask slipping further. For the first time, his confidence cracked. You think you can threaten me? He hissed. Richard's voice remained calm, almost soft. I don't need to threaten. I only need to choose whether I end this quietly or publicly. Walk away, Victor. Leave this town, leave me, and leave the next man before you destroy him too. Because this time you picked the wrong target. For a long moment, Victor said nothing. His eyes darted, his breath shallow. The smooth businessman was gone now, replaced by something harsher, rawer, a man unmasked. Finally, he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His smile returned, but it was thin, brittle. Very well, he said coldly, if that's how you want it. But remember, Richard, opportunities don't wait forever. He turned and strode out of the diner, his polished shoes clicking sharply, his shoulders tense. The bell above the door rang one last time, and then he was gone, swallowed by the night. The diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She didn't know the details of the conversation, but she knew enough. Richard had faced the man she feared, and he had not been fooled. Richard sat back, his face calm again, though his eyes carried the weight of what had just passed. He glanced toward Emily, just for a second, and in that small glance there was a quiet acknowledgement, as though he were saying without words, "You were right." Emily lowered her eyes, her cheeks warm, and went back to work, though inside her heart felt lighter, stronger, as if she had played a small part in protecting something much bigger than herself. Richard remained at the table for a few minutes longer, speaking quietly with his lawyer, confirming that the documents would remain locked and ready in case Victor tried again. Then he rose, leaving the diner with the same calm dignity as always. Outside, the streets were empty, the night air cool. Richard knew the battle wasn't over. Men like Victor didn't disappear so easily. But for now, his fortune, his reputation, and his future were safe. Not because of wealth or lawyers, but because of a whisper from a waitress who trusted her instincts. And as he walked back toward his car, Richard felt something unusual for a man of his power. Gratitude. The night after their confrontation, Richard returned to his hotel, but he could not sleep. He had faced Victor Kane and exposed his lies, yet something inside him whispered that it was not over. Men like Victor did not accept defeat so easily. They thrived on control, on twisting situations until they gained the upper hand again. Richard had seen it in Victor's eyes before he walked out of the diner. The look of a predator denied its prey. That kind of man always tried again. His instinct proved right the next morning. A call came from his assistant in New York. Her voice was urgent. "Mr. Hale, you should know. Victor has been reaching out to other investors. He's using your name, saying you're already on board with his project. He's trying to lure them in by claiming your trust." Richard's jaw tightened as he listened. It was exactly the kind of trick he expected. Victor knew he could no longer trap Richard directly, so he tried another path, using Richard's reputation to bait others. That was the danger of being a billionaire whose name carried weight. One false rumor could make or break fortunes. He hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring out at the sea. The stakes were higher than before. It was no longer just his fortune at risk. It was the fortunes of others who might believe Victor's lies. If Richard did nothing, men and women across the world could fall into the same trap, lose everything, and blame him for leading them there. The waitress's warning had saved him, but now he had to save others. Later that afternoon, he arranged to meet Victor one last time. The place was not the diner this time, but a private lounge in the hotel, a quiet room with leather chairs and dim lights. Richard waited calmly, Harris the lawyer at his side, a folder of documents on the table. When Victor arrived, his smile was back, polished and confident, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Richard," Victor greeted as though nothing had happened. "I hear we have more to discuss." Richard didn't waste words. "Stop using my name. Stop spreading lies about me being involved in your projects. If I hear it again, I will make sure every court in this country knows who you really are." Victor chuckled, shaking his head, as though Richard's threat amused him. "Come now, this is business. Your name opens doors. Why not use it to our advantage? We could both profit. You're too smart to let pride get in the way." Richard's eyes hardened. "This is not about pride. It's about truth. You trick people, Victor. You promise fortunes and leave them with nothing. You tried it with me, but you failed. Now you want to drag others down. I won't allow it." Victor leaned forward, lowering his voice to a hiss. "And what will you do? You think people care about the truth? They care about stories. They care about success. I know how to give them that illusion, and illusions are more powerful than facts." Richard opened the folder, sliding a stack of papers across the table. "Facts are exactly what I have. Lawsuits, testimonies, failed projects, contracts filled with traps. You've left a trail, Victor, and I've gathered every piece. The next time you use my name, these go public. And when they do, no one will invest with you again. You'll be finished." For a long moment, Victor stared at the papers, his smile gone. His fingers twitched as though he wanted to grab them, to tear them apart, but he didn't dare. Slowly, he leaned back, his expression turning cold. "You're making an enemy you don't need, Richard." Richard's voice remained calm. "No, Victor. You made yourself my enemy the moment you tried to use me. And you lost." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His polished mask was cracked now, his charm replaced by fury. "This isn't over," he snapped. "One day you'll regret crossing me." But Richard didn't flinch. He simply closed the folder and said quietly, "No, Victor. You'll regret trying to cross me." Victor stormed out, his footsteps echoing in the hall until the door slammed shut. The room grew quiet again, but Richard and Harris both knew the danger had not disappeared completely. Men like Victor often tried to resurface in new places under new names, but at least now, Richard had stopped him here and protected others from falling into his web. That night, as Richard walked once more through the streets of the small town, he passed by the diner. Inside, he saw Emily wiping down tables, humming softly to herself, unaware of the storm she had helped prevent. He paused at the window, a small smile touching his lips. Her whisper had saved him and perhaps many others too. Without her courage, he might have signed away billions or worse, let his name be used to destroy lives. He didn't step inside, not yet. He wanted the moment to be right. But as he turned away and walked into the cool night, he knew he owed her more than just thanks. He owed her a debt he would never forget. The next morning brought news from his assistant. Victor Kane had disappeared from the town overnight. His hotel room was empty, his belongings gone. No one saw him leave, but that was his style. When exposed, he vanished, only to reappear somewhere else with a new story. But this time, Richard had blocked him, and with the evidence ready in Harris's hands, Victor's next step would not be so easy. Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The close call was over. His empire was safe. And he knew with certainty that had it not been for the waitress's whisper, things could have ended very differently. Still, he also knew one more thing. The story was not finished yet. There was one last part to write, one last thing to do. He had to return to the diner, look into Emily's eyes, and tell her what her warning had meant. Because sometimes even billionaires needed saving. And she had saved him. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the little coastal town, waves rolling gently against the shore, fishermen already out at sea. The diner was waking up to its usual rhythm, the smell of coffee brewing, the sound of plates clinking, and the soft chatter of locals who came in for their breakfast. Emily Carter moved between tables with her usual smile, carrying trays of toast and eggs, never imagining that her life was about to change forever. She thought often about the billionaire who had sat by the window just days ago. She still remembered the weight of her own words, whispered so quietly she thought he might not even hear them. Don't trust him. Sometimes she wondered if she had done the right thing. Maybe it had been foolish. Maybe he had laughed about it later, telling his rich friends how a waitress thought she could warn him about business. She tried to push the thought away, focusing on her work, because the truth was she would never know what happened after that night. But that morning, the bell above the diner's door rang, and every sound in the room seemed to pause. Richard Hale stepped inside. He looked calm as always, his dark suit neat, his silver-streaked hair catching the light. Yet there was something softer in his eyes this time, something warmer. The customers all turned their heads, whispering quietly, but Richard paid them no attention. His gaze went straight to Emily. She froze for a moment, her tray in her hands, her heart thudding hard in her chest. He walked over to her slowly, with the kind of steady grace that made the whole diner fall silent. Emily forced herself to smile politely, as she would for any customer. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. "Your usual table?" Richard shook his head. "No," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "This time, I came here for you." Emily blinked, confused, glancing around to make sure he was really speaking to her. "For me?" she asked in a whisper. He nodded, and then, in front of the entire diner, he spoke words she would never forget. "You saved me," he said. "More than money, more than reputation. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life." The room went silent. Every customer leaned closer, curious, but Richard's eyes never left Emily's. She felt her throat tighten, her hands trembling around the tray. "I don't understand," she said honestly. "All I did was—" "You warned me," Richard finished for her. "When no one else did. When you had nothing to gain. You trusted your instincts, and you gave me the truth in 3 simple words. Because of that, I was able to stop a man who would have cost me everything. Do you realize what that means?" Emily shook her head slowly, still stunned. She couldn't imagine that her small whisper, spoken out of instinct, could have changed the path of a billionaire's life. But Richard's eyes told her it was true. He reached into his jacket and placed an envelope on the counter beside her. She stared at it, hesitant, but he gave a gentle nod. "It's not charity," he said softly. "It's gratitude. You didn't just protect me. You protected others who might have been hurt by him. People I'll never even meet. And for that, I want to make sure you're rewarded." Emily's hands shook as she opened the envelope, and when she saw the number written on the check inside, her breath caught. It wasn't just a generous tip. It was enough to change her life, enough to pay her family's debts, to send her younger brother to college, to secure a future she had never dared to dream of. Tears filled her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by the attention. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Just keep being who you are," Richard said gently. "Someone who listens to her instincts. Someone brave enough to speak when others stay silent. That's worth more than money." The diner filled with soft murmurs. Customers who had watched in silence now smiled. Some even clapped quietly. Emily's face flushed with emotion. She had never been the center of attention, never been praised in such a way, and now a man whose name was known across the world was thanking her like she was the one who mattered most. But Richard wasn't finished. He looked around the diner, at the old wooden chairs, the peeling paint, the cracked tiles on the floor. Then he turned back to Emily. "This place gave me something priceless," he said. "It gave me your voice at the right time, so I'm going to give something back." Within weeks, the little diner began to change. Richard invested in it quietly, not to turn it into something flashy, but to protect it, to help it grow without losing its heart. New paint covered the walls, new tables filled the space, and the kitchen received equipment that made the cook grin like a boy on Christmas morning. Locals began to talk about how the billionaire had chosen their small town, Not for business, not for profit, but because of a single waitress who had dared to speak up. Emily continued to work there, though her life was different now. She no longer worried about bills late at night, no longer carried the same heavy fears. Still, she stayed at the diner because she loved it, because it was where she belonged. And sometimes, when the door opened and she saw Richard walk in, choosing the same table by the window, she remembered that one moment, that whisper, and how it had changed everything. As for Richard, he knew he would never forget. His empire was safe, his fortune intact, but what stayed with him was not the money he almost lost. It was the lesson he gained, that sometimes the greatest wisdom doesn't come from boardrooms or polished speeches. Sometimes it comes from the quiet courage of an ordinary voice. And so, whenever he returned to that little town, he always made sure to stop by the diner, to sit by the window, to drink his coffee black, and to thank silently the waitress who had once leaned close and whispered, "Don't trust him," because those words had saved him, not just his fortune, but his faith in the power of truth.